Hi guys, Totallydubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the BenQ Mobiuz EX2710. It's a Full HD 27-inch 1440p IPS monitor. Now the monitor can be found for $300 in the US and £270 in the UK. The links in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store. It's also worth bearing in mind there are alternatives down there. For example, I reviewed the 24-inch AOC 24G2U. That's pretty much similar to the Mobiuz that we've got over here, apart from the fact it doesn't have HDR capabilities. So worth bearing that in mind, and also it is very much similarly priced at the 27-inch range, which you can see behind us. Now before jumping into the review, if you do have Instagram, I'd very much appreciate a follow. It's at TotallyDubbed. And if you're interested in all electric or hybrid news or reviews, do check out TotallyEV. Your support would be very much greatly appreciated. So without further ado, let's see if this BenQ monitor is worth your money. So first off, let's talk about raw specs. This is a 27-inch IPS panel. You can find it in a smaller variant, as I mentioned before. It's also got a max refresh rate of 144 Hz with a quoted response time of 1 milliseconds MPRT, while 2 milliseconds G2G. So worth bearing that in mind when you're comparing and contrasting, although those are marketing claims, and I will get into response time in my gaming performance section of the review very shortly. Aside from that, it's got HDR support, which is nice to see, and it's also got AMD FreeSync support, and yes, that will run an NVIDIA G-Sync, and I'll be talking about that given the fact I have an RTX 2080 Super. Now elsewhere, the monitor has two HDMI 2.0 ports, one DisplayPort 1.2 ports, a headphone jack output via 3.5mm jack, and it's got two 2.5 watt speakers, which are actually pretty impressive to say the least. Moving on from there, we've got the monitor's build quality and design. Now personally, I'm not too much of a fan of its kind of orange trim, this kind of rubbery material which resides by the stand, but nevertheless the stand itself provides all the normal adjustments that you might expect, and it's great to see that there is no sort of compromises here, even though it's somewhat of a budget monitor. Furthermore, the monitor itself is not wobbly, the stand is pretty sturdy. Of course you can replace it if you so wish, but in my case I feel that it'll be perfectly acceptable. It is also a three-sided borderless design monitor, which means that it will take less space on your desk, specifically given this one is a 27-inch variant. It doesn't really look like the older 27-inch variants, which have pretty thick bezels. And now we get onto the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed through a little joystick button found at the bottom right of the monitor. Now there's three quick access settings which you can customize. You can see I've got brightness, AMA and low blue light mode, and if we enter the menu itself, you can see you've got inputs, so you can change the inputs and also change the modes that it's in. You've got the quick menu, which I was referring to, and you can customize the quick menu per mode, which is even better. And then you've got the color modes. So what I would suggest is either sRGB mode or standard mode. Of course your mileage may vary depending on how you want it set up and what you're going to be using the monitor for. You can see over here on the color temperature you can also adjust the RGB values, and you've got the AMA, which we'll touch upon in just a bit, and that is essentially like overdrive. Moving on, we've got eye care, BI+, so you can enable or disable that. That's due to a little light meter found at the front of the monitor, and therefore allowing you to basically have the monitor, this is calibrated to your room, but essentially a little bit more responsive to the environment around you. And then you've got the audio, which actually is pretty surprisingly good. So this has built-in speakers, as I mentioned, and the built-in speakers are not that bad. It doesn't get super loud, but the overall frequency response of the monitor's built-in speakers is actually pretty impressive. And you've also got three different EQs to choose from. I would choose a cinema mode if you want a little more bass. Of course you'll need to be outputting audio via your monitor, although I'd always suggest a DAC or amp instead. And as for the system setup, you can see over here it's pretty self-explanatory. I think the most important part over here is the information to know about what resolution and refresh rate you're running at. Finally, I will mention about HDR. There's a little button found at the bottom right of the monitor over here, as you can see, and if you click this you can select through the different pre-calibrated HDR modes. HDR normally will automatically be enabled if you have an HDR display, and therefore that mode will automatically enable, and you'll have a little pop-up banner of saying HDR on. And now we get on to performance, and first off let's talk about image quality. Now this monitor has a dedicated sRGB mode, and as a result I use my Datacolor SpiderX Elite to see how well it's actually performed. Now in the sRGB mode, the monitor hits 96.9% of the gamut coverage while covering 98 98.9% of the gamut volume. If you were to go on normal mode, so out of sRGB mode, the results are somewhat skewed. You get 98.4% and 118.6%, so therefore surpassing the kind of sRGB scale and not exactly looking accurate. Now in the sRGB mode, the color accuracy is pretty good, to say the least. Now the monitor hits an average delta of 1.21 with a maximum of 2.93. While this is very impressive, it's not as impressive as the AOC24G2U, which I previously reviewed. Again, in normal mode, this isn't exactly in the sRGB scale, but the results go worse at 2.14 average delta E and a maximum of 7.27. Quite frankly, the monitor looks great outside the box. You don't really have to calibrate it or anything like that. I will say that a lot of gamers will be very pleasantly surprised at how well this IPS monitor looks like to the naked eye. Of course, if you're a professional, then you might want to either look elsewhere or potentially professionally calibrate the monitor. Now the thing I wasn't impressed about, however, was its contrast ratio. It varied from around 930 to 1000 to 1, which for an IPS panel is pretty poor. I would expect around 1100 to 1300 even at this price range. I feel that BenQ could have done a little bit better in this department. Moving on, we've got brightness, and here it's a little bit interesting because in SDR, so without the HDR signal input enabled, then you'll get a maximum of 300 nits, which is perfectly acceptable, but it's just worth bearing in mind that that 400 quoted nits that you are seeing on BenQ's website is actually in reference to its HDR performance. Now in minimum brightness you get to around 54 nits, which is pretty nice and low, so for those people gaming at night you'll be pretty pleased. In sRGB mode it gets limited to 200 nits, while if you enable blur reduction and crank it all the way down, in other words the brightness, so therefore blur reduction on, brightness all the way down, you get down to a staggering 16 nits, and that's pretty much impossible to see your monitor, but it's great to see that the monitor can stretch all the way down in terms of that brightness for those people who play in late night gaming sessions. Now following on from that, we've got the brightness uniformity, which in my case wasn't bad, although it could be just a little bit better, again specifically compared to the AOC24G2U that I previously reviewed. Here the BenQ Mobiuz EX2710 is, well, okay throughout the panel. There is a little bit of backlight bleed as well that occurs, and you'll be able to see for yourself through the images that are on your screen. Now as for HDR, and this is somewhat towards the gaming performance side of the review as well, I will say that the HDR signal is okay. There's no issues when it comes to reproducing, let's say, more vibrant colors, specifically because the brightness gets cranked up a little bit past this 300 nits SDR range. Although I will just say that the HDR is, not really convincing. At a maximum of 400 nits, you're not going to get an incredible HDR performance. It's nice to see it, don't get me wrong, included. I just feel like BenQ could have potentially focused their efforts elsewhere. Now past HDR, we've also got NVIDIA G-Sync/FreeSync. Now I don't have an AMD graphics card to test, but I will say with my RTX 2080 Super, I had no problems running the Pendulum demo, and indeed having NVIDIA G-Sync running whilst having 1440p on my monitor. That's also connected via DisplayPort. So of course your mileage may vary depending on your graphics card, but as a general rule I think it should work for most people. And now we get on to competitive gaming, and here I wanted to put the monitor under the most scrutiny because its AOC alternative is actually spectacularly good in this domain. Now for someone who's played over 2,000 hours of competitive Counter-Strike and also has reviewed over 160 monitors, I felt that this BenQ could have just been a little bit more responsive. Now first off, let's talk about input lag, which is arguably one of the most important elements for competitive shooters or people who play competitive shooters. In this respect, the monitor's input lag is good, although it's not as excellent as I was expecting it to be. Again, in comparison to the AOC alternative or even BenQ's 1440p alternative, this budget quote-unquote 1080p monitor just didn't come across as low input lag as I expected. Input lag aside, in terms of the responsiveness of the panel, you can lob AMA to the maximum level, so I think it's level 3 out of level 0, and here you'll get a little bit of inverse ghosting. Now in a game that looks like a potato, such as Counter-Strike, it's not much of a concern. You will notice a slight bit of overshoot ghosting versus AMA on 0 versus AMA on the maximum level. However, it will be perfectly acceptable. go on a more casual game such as Destiny 2, then that inverse ghosting might throw a little bit, a few people off, specifically when it comes to, let's say, dealing with foliage around trees. It can be just a little bit more intensive, and therefore you will notice a little bit more of that sort of purple trailing, which is not really well, liked by a lot of people. I can't think of anyone who likes ghosting. Now, in this respect, you might want to dial down AMA, specifically if you're playing more of a casual game, so this might not bother you. But anyway, for competitive gamers, what I'll say is responsiveness is good, yet again like its input lag, but it's not excellent. Again, slightly disappointing. Now, you can enable the low blur mode, the blur reduction mode, and this will pretty much reduce its inverse ghosting, although again will limit its brightness as well, so just worth considering all of those traits that brings in comparison to, you know, in the responsiveness of the panel. So this all leads me on to my verdict. What do I make about the BenQ Mobiuz EX2710? Well, quite frankly, the monitor is good across pretty much all domains. It's got a sturdy stand, it's got a nice look, comprehensive OSD, its color accuracy is decent, and furthermore, its gaming performance is okay as well. It's also got HDR signal as well, so that is great for, let's say, console gamers. The problem over here is the fact that it's facing stiff competition from the AOC alternative, which not only offers better color accuracy, better contrast ratio, but fundamentally a far better gaming responsiveness and also lower input lag, which makes it a far better pick for PC gamers. If you are someone who is really looking for an HDR monitor at this price tag, then yes, you can go get this monitor and you'll be perfectly happy with it. If you don't care about HDR and you don't need it, then just consider its AOC instead, AOC alternative instead, because it's cheaper and, as I said, it's just better performance all across the board. Now, that's just my opinion and my thoughts about it. If you do like my honest review, make sure you give it a like, subscribe to see more independent content, and of course favourite and share, as it'll always help the channel grow. Alright guys, I've been Totally Dubbed, take care and bye bye.